Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our panel on the Peruvian Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The Peruvian Truth and Reconciliation Commission worked from 2001 to 2003, conducting a far-reaching investigation of crimes and human rights violations committed during the 20-year internal armed conflict from 1980 to 2000, looking at its underlying causes and enduring consequences. The Commission's final report, released on August 28, 2003, stands out as one of the strongest and most encompassing reports in the robust tradition of truth commissions around the world. I truly think it can be said that the Peruvian Commission is one of the most robust and thorough and best deserves the status of model of the over 40 truth commissions that have taken place in the world in the past generation. The report was immediately followed by an abbreviated version bearing the title Hatun Willakuy, a Quechua term meaning great story, which made the findings and recommendations of the Commission accessible to a broader Spanish-speaking audience in Peru and beyond. Today, 3 institutions have joined together to make it available to a wider public through the publication of the English version of Hatun Willakuy. The 3 institutions are the Center for Civil and Human Rights of the University of Notre Dame, the Institute for Democracy and Human Rights of the Pontifical Catholic University of Peru, and the International Center for Transitional Justice, all of whom are proud of this endeavor, which will allow a larger share of practitioners, stakeholders, scholars, and public officials in generally interested audiences to benefit from a truth-seeking experience that deserves to be better known. This effort builds, for the Center for Civil and Human Rights, this effort builds on a historic legacy of publishing the 1993 English translation of the report of the Chilean National Commission on Truth and Reconciliation. And this was a very important truth commission that went on to influence South Africa, which built on, in many ways, improved upon Chile, and many others built on and improved upon that model, including Peru. The work of the Peruvian Commission and its final report represent a strong example of academic rigor and commitment to the cause of human rights. Equally important is the influence of the Peruvian example in the field of transitional justice, as, like I say, as other truth commissions around the world have studied it, seeking inspiration and practical answers to concrete questions. Many efforts have been brought together to create this edition. The heavy lifting of preparing the original translation was done by Lucien Chavin and Barbara Fraser. We're also glad to mention that it benefits from the powerful visual work, and there are some extraordinary painting pictures and drawings throughout, of Peruvian artist Mauricio Delgado Castillo. So we invite you to explore through this online publication the story of the violence perpetrated in Peru and to learn about the country's quest for justice and truth. We are convinced that through our acquaintance with diverse national efforts, the international community becomes better prepared to confront impunity, official silence, and indifference towards violence, as well as repression and widespread abuses. The content of Hatun Willakuy speaks for itself. So I want to introduce our panelists. My name is Dan Philpott, and I'm Director of the Center for Civil and Human Rights. Presenting the new publication will be Kellen Marigali, an associate of the International Center for Transitional Justice's Truth and Memory Program. She's a lawyer from Brazil and also worked for the Brazilian Amnesty Commission, so has long experience in transitional justice. Then our panel members begin with my colleague Doug Castle, who's professor of law and Notre Dame Presidential Fellow at Notre Dame Law School. And he is one of my two predecessors ago as director of the Center for Civil and Human Rights from 2005 to 2011. Doug served as legal advisor to the United States Commission on the Truth for El Salvador.
United Nations, please.
Sorry, what did I say?
UN, not US.
Oh, yeah, yes. Especially in this case, that's an important difference. In the United Nations Commission on the Truth for El Salvador, and has been a consultant to truth commissions in several other countries, including Peru's Truth and Reconciliation Commission. He currently serves as a member of the board of the Justice Studies Center of the Americas, to which he was elected by the Organization of American States. His current research interests include the human rights responsibilities of transnational corporations, international law options for combating terrorism, strengthening of international human rights institutions, and the history of human rights. And tonight he'll be talking about, in light of the Peruvian Truth Commission, the issue of what counts as truth and what doesn't. What is allowed, what kind of truth can be told publicly and what kinds can't, or has to be more muted. What are the dynamics behind that? Eduardo Gonzalez, a Peruvian sociologist, is the director of the International Center for Transitional Justice's Truth and Memory program, providing advice to countries on truth commissions, the declassification of archives, memorialization activities, museums, and other instruments. He has given technical and strategic support to truth-seeking initiatives in places as diverse as East Timor, Morocco, Liberia, Canada, and the Western Balkans. Before joining ICTJ, he helped organize and carry out the Peruvian TRC, where he worked as the director of public hearings and victim protection, and later as an editor of the Commission's final report. Previously, he worked as an advocate for the establishment of the International Criminal Court. Eduardo will discuss the evolution of truth commissions over time toward institutions of greater complexity and more ambitious mandates, and the role that the Peruvian TRC occupies in that trajectory, coming immediately after South Africa and Guatemala. Then finally, Iris Yave is a journalist and political scientist, currently serving as coordinator of the projects and institutional relations of the Catholic University of Peru's Institute of Democracy and Human Rights. She specializes in political communication, in the design and development of diagnostics, maps of actors and advocacy strategies, handling relations with government institutions and social organizations, and lobbying opinion leaders and journalists. She has been manager of communications and public relations of the municipality of Lima and advisory to the senior management of the Peruvian Defense Ministry. She will discuss the political impact of the report in terms of public policy and political and social spaces. She'll also discuss something about the advances, delays, and retreats in that country's transition that the report might be responsible for, as well as new challenges that arise as the transition is still going on, especially among the youth. So let me then turn the floor over to Kelly. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. Good evening. Well, it's great to see some familiar faces. I would like to invite you all to navigate on the pages tonight of this new edition of the Hatun Willakuy that I'm about now to introduce to you. This page was developed to the readers to facilitate the understanding of each one of the chapters, of the 8 chapters that we have here of the abbreviated report. And I'm going now to show you each one of the sections, and around there I'm going to start opening to you the main elements that we have here for you. So, first of all, I also would like to thank here, before I start, Matt Lemon was the one who assisted us with the design of the book that I'm going to open for you very shortly. He was great in designing the graphics that you are going to see. Daniel already mentioned the work of Mauricio Delgado. Mauricio did such an amazing job. He used flower prints, and on top of it, he drew these paintings that you see based on photographs that were taken, if I'm not mistaken, during the work of the commission. So these pictures were the cover of some newspapers, and he took them and he printed them with flowers. And his exhibition is called De Infortunios y Flores, and it was, I think, an exhibition that he did in 2006. I'm also going to show you his website very quickly. And also I would like to thank Meredith Vargas. She works for us, she's here with us tonight. She did a great job putting all the pieces together for the website that you are now are going to see. So here you have a brief introduction to the project and what it means, and how this edition is also presented here, summarize the result of the Peruvian Commission, but it's also a commemoration that started last year with the 10th anniversary of the Commission. So here you see one of his works, of Maurice's works. Here you have access to the 9 volumes, the original volumes that are available here at the Commission's website for people who wanted to see the originals in Spanish. Going down, the book is divided into 2 main parts, and then you have a summary of each one of the chapters to allow the reader to understand, as I said before, what it means, each one of them. Here you have a graphic that also was created by of the True Commission, but it was designed by Matt Lemon for our publication. So you have some elements here to facilitate, I think, some access. We did with this publication is to read the full text of the chapter. You have access here to each one of them. So when you click, it will directly open chapter 1, as you can see here. It should be page 19. Sorry about that. So you have here one of the chapters, each one of them, when you read down. Then you move forward, you have each one of the 8 chapters. Am I going too quickly? You have here to give some attention to the 9 images that were produced by Mauricio. That made the violence possible. Chapter 6, when you click here, it's going to chapter 6. And here you go to the general conclusions, and you can find too some access to the artist's websites, as I told you before. When you click here, you have Maurice's website, which is a great source, I think. Eduardo can also share with you a little bit more of his work that we have been doing. You have a collection of photos of the Open Act to Remember. It was an exhibition that also was from the True Commission in Peru that they had created. ICTJ, as I told you before, has a celebration that started last year. They created also a website to tell a little bit more the history and what was the impact nowadays with the True Commission in 2001 to 2003. And you also have access to the Spanish edition. So we would like to invite you all, guys, to disseminate this website among English speakers and to turn this into a very useful tool for everyone, for students, for scholars, to academics. And thank you everyone for coming tonight. Thank you.
have decided to change the order. All right. Good night to all of you. I think I should start with a funny story first.
No.
But this is very interesting, and it's actually the closure of a circle for me, because the first time ever I heard about truth commissions was in a LASA event in DC, in Chicago, in the mid-90s. And I heard about truth commissions through the experience of El Salvador that was presented by one Douglas Castle. To whom I made a couple of questions, and I started to ask him different things about El Salvador, because I was very interested in El Salvador, not because of truth commissions, but because of the FMLN. I had sympathies for what the FMLN had done during the 90s, and I was curious about whether truth commissions would be some sort of an examination of the justness of a conflict, or whether they do something else. And Douglas actually explained to me very helpfully that what truth commissions do has nothing to do actually with the politics of the conflict, but actually with the human cost of what the conflicts, independently of their causes, have and do. And so it was for me very useful, because it helped me move from a certain paradigm, interested in the politics of the processes of violence, into the costs of these processes, and into the human rights dimension. And obviously, when we got to the history of the Peruvian Truth Commission, one of the things that is so difficult to understand for people who understand and to read the report, or people who talk about the report of the Truth Commission of Peru, is that the essence of what a narrative is supposed to do about the past is to make that distinction. That is, the distinction between the causes that led a country to be in such a kind of conflict, and the judgments that you may have about who was in the right, or who started this conflict. And on the other side, the inescapable fact that independently of the causes and the reasons and the justifications, there were costs. And that the form in which you wage a war also matters. And finally, for me, a few years after meeting Douglas in that particular LASA event, the reflections led me to think that perhaps my own interest in political science was a little bit misplaced, and I started to look into issues of human rights, which is how I came to meet a couple of friends like by the names of Pancho Soberon and William Pace, who asked me whether I would like to intern for a small organization called the Coalition for the International Criminal Court. And I thought, well, why not? I mean, that sounds like an interesting thing to do. I can learn lots of things, but I didn't believe at all that international law could make any difference, because again, my framework of reference was strictly political. So I thought, well, human rights sounds like a good idea, but in the ultimate essence, the defining point is not what is in the law, but what is in power. Might, not right, will make history. And I was thinking that, and I was saying, for example, this was 1998, and I was telling a friend, when I was talking about these ideas, I remember telling to a friend, look, human rights law is very nice, but I tell you, Augusto Pinochet is never going to face justice for what he did. And I said that in October 1998. And 1 week after I said that, Pinochet was arrested in London. So as you can imagine, you can see a number of events were leading me to a career in human rights. And so, a little bit after that, I started to study issues of human rights. At that point, I had been very interested in the theory of transitions to democracy. It's quite an interesting point. We're talking about the mid to the end of the 90s. And of course, their book to read and their collection to read was the compilation on transitions to democracy, like Guillermo O'Donnell and a number of extraordinary political scientists. And I started to realize that the theory of transitions to democracy had some kind of a blind spot, and that blind spot was the treatment of the past. Because everything about the transition to democracy could be negotiated. And the whole theory of transitions to democracy was that you obtain a transition through a number of compromises and negotiations. And through those compromises and negotiations, you tame the extremists on both sides, both the hard, right-wing, probably militaristic groups in a dictatorship, and the most radical left-wing activists on the democratic side. But in a way, you can make them negotiate, you can make them compromise, because in the end, everything can be compromised and can be negotiated if it is quantitative. But the problem was, what do you do with the past? Because you can probably tell a radical leader of a union, we will negotiate over money and over production and over salaries in the next 10 years if we get a transition to democracy. But what are you going to tell to the mother of the disappear? You know, you accept to get into this new democratic framework, and you know, you accept not to create uncomfortable situations for our former military leaders. And in exchange of that, we will give you now 10% of information we know about your son, or your husband, or your daughter. That cannot happen. Victims of human rights violations committed by authoritarian regimes in the past are in an uncomfortable situation of being always considered the spoilers of the democratic transitions and the spoilers of the peace processes, because they ask for something that is in direct opposition to existential interests of the parties of a negotiation. They are uncomfortable, and they are often blamed in the so-called dilemma of peace versus justice or democracy versus justice. And truth commissions appeared as a way to try to navigate that kind of dilemma. And they have tried to, as I say, address this issue, this innegotiable essence of the claim about the past, through an instrument that is quite paradoxical. Because what a truth commission does is to try to create an authoritative expert history of the past through the voices of those who are not experts, the voices of survivors. So you have truth commissions that are highly sophisticated institutions led by sociologists, historians, philosophers, and who even now are identified with the important jurists and religious leaders that led them. But in reality, the only thing they do is to build a narrative on the basis of the voices of the excluded, the voices of the most insignificant ones. And I think that is their big contribution. Over the years, what has happened is that as more truth commissions have emerged, it has been possible to argue, and I think convincingly, that looking for the truth is becoming practice. That the practice of countries, through the establishment of truth commissions, and through a number of judicial sentences, is indicating the growing recognition that to know the facts about the human rights violation is an actual right, for which victims have. And so, by the aggregation of the work of truth commissions, and by the aggregation of decisions and sentences by Supreme Courts, and the Inter-American Court, and the European courts, and others, you have seen something that has happened in the last 15, 20 years. The affirmation that the right to the truth is a concrete right with equal value to the right that the victims have to obtain reparations, or the right that they have to pursue criminal prosecutions of the perpetrators. And I think that is a fundamental normative event in the last few years. And so what has happened then in the last 2 decades, or perhaps 3 decades if we go back to the CONADEP in Argentina, is a growing sophistication of the instruments by which governments realize that they have to comply with this right to the truth, and with their own duty of preserving memory. Truth commissions have evolved from the very simple affair that was the Argentine Comisión Nacional sobre la Desaparición de Personas, which, when you think of it, was an institution investigating one violation, disappearances, by one particular agent, the military, in a very concrete period of time, the 7 years of the dictatorship, and that published a book that was basically a description of the violations, with very few conclusions and recommendations. It was basically a descriptive account of what had taken place. We have gone from that to extremely complex institutions. The recent Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Kenya, for example, has a mandate that was passed by law, not by decree like Argentina, Peru, or Chile, that includes about 18 different functions. Not just the function of accounting for the facts, but a host of other functions that have to do with prevention, policy recommendations, etc. And it's a mandate that includes a number of human rights violations, not just forced disappearances or arbitrary executions or other discrete forms of violation. And moreover, that commission is mandated to investigate not just the violations that we call gross human rights violations, that is violations of inderogable rights, such as the right to life, the right to be protected from torture, etc., but also violations of economic, social, and cultural rights. So truth commissions have expanded their scope enormously. It is not without problems, because of course a commission with such an enormous mandate will find itself facing tremendous challenges, technical and certainly political, because they will need more political support to deal with all that. And that is something that we are seeing now in the field of transitional justice, the enormous difficulties that new truth commissions have. When you think today of the fact that the Colombian government is negotiating with the FARC the terms of a peace agreement with 5 points, the 5th of which is the rights of victims, you can imagine how consequential it is for us to be discussing what we're discussing in this last conference and what we are discussing now in terms of the right to the truth. Because however the peace process in Colombia is conducted, it has been recognized by the parties that the right to the truth is going to be an element of the final agreement. Just as they recognized that in El Salvador in 1992, and as they recognized in the Guatemala Oslo peace process in 1993. And you can only imagine how the Truth Commission look like for Colombia. A conflict that has lasted about 50 years, enormous violations in scale and in brutality and in cruelty. So I think that it is timely and appropriate that we review the history of truth commissions and we investigate a few milestones of the history of truth commissions. From these early commissions like Argentina and Chile, very simple, very concrete fact-finding inquiries, to these commissions that are far more complex, because that is how the future is going to look. Or look at the Brazilian Truth Commission, which is apparently a normal truth commission, a regular truth commission, until you realize that Brazil, being such an enormous country, has created also about 10 local truth commissions on top of the national one. So you have the National Commission of Brazil, and you have the Truth Commission of Sao Paulo, the Truth Commission of Rio, the Truth Commission of Pernambuco, etc. So this is a field that is growing enormously, and it's a field in which experiences have learned from each other. When we were in front of the mandate, and I promise I finish with this, when we were in front of the mandate that had been passed in a few months of intense activism after the fall of Fujimori, of course, I guess what we were all thinking was, what have we done? We had a mandate there that was contained in just 2 pages. We had some ideas of what the Truth Commission was, and we knew we had the intuition of the enormity of the conflict that we had suffered. But we really had no idea what were we going to do. How was this commission going to look like, actually? And so what we did was what a number of members of Truth Commissions have been doing ever since. Ask. And Douglas came to Peru, and a number of colleagues came to Peru. And I remember us actually discussing the fact that we receive very different and sometimes contradictory advice. Because we have on the one side the colleagues from Chile, for example, who came and told us what you need to do is to establish the facts with quasi-judicial certainty, so that whatever interpretations are there, they are never going to be able to deny the facts, and you want to avoid the possibility of denial. And on the other side, we had our colleagues from Guatemala, and that commission had ended just a couple of years before the Peruvian commission started, telling us what you have to do is to establish the root causes of this conflict. What you need to do is to establish a serious historical and sociological examination of what happened. Because the facts can be presented and interpreted in different ways, and what you want to do is to establish a strong interpretation of facts, one that commits the country to democracy, to rule of law, to the respect of human rights. What do we do? And so what we did was a very Peruvian response, a very Peruvian style answer to contradictory tendencies. We mixed up there. And so the final report of the Truth Commission, when you look at it, has 9 volumes, which indicates to you that we had a lot of difficulty synthesizing. But also it indicates to you that basically every discipline had a volume. Because you have volumes that are focused on the facts, on fact-finding, volumes that are clearly written by lawyers, and you have volumes that are interpretations of how the conflict was experienced psychologically by the victims, or how the conflict was experienced in the local history of the particular region that we are talking about, etc. And Hatun Willakuy, what we have here, has an interesting challenge, which is to summarize that. The actual final report of the Truth Commission has 9 volumes, is over 4,000 pages long, not counting annexes, which are about 4,000 more pages, and I don't exaggerate. And so Hatun Willakuy was a selection of a few chapters that we thought would be representative of the whole and would give the reader a notion of the history that we had reconstructed. I have never been completely sure whether we did a good job in the selection of those chapters, but I think they give indeed a flavor of what is it that we have found. And so I think this can be, the translation of this into English can be a useful instrument. What I think this can do, and I hope this is what it does, is what Listening About El Salvador a few years ago did for me, which was to help change minds, which was to help people think in another way of issues that, for which they are applying certain frameworks. If this can be read in South Sudan at some point, if this can be read in the Western Balkans, if this can be read by some guys in a unionist neighborhood in Northern Ireland, and now they can read it because it's in English. If this can be read in Thailand, if this can be read somewhere else, I think it may help people realize that there are certain tools to deal with issues that are intractable, such as very conflicted and divided memories. So I think this is an effort that has been very worth taken. Notre Dame had worked on the translation of the Hatun Willakuy a long time ago, as soon as the Peruvian Commission ended its work practically. But there were a number of issues, vicissitudes, funding that goes and comes, and the report was there, translated, waiting to be published. And I think it was fabulous and again serendipitous that Christine came to New York to visit Pablo the Grave, I think. And it just so happens that my office is next to Pablo's. So we started talking about it, and we decided this was a good idea to resuscitate and to launch. So I think, that even though we're talking about an issue like history and structures and tendencies that lead events, there is also serendipity involved. and personal efforts, and I'm very glad to be present in this. It's a very special moment for me, and I think it's going to be useful for many people outside of this room. Thanks.
Buenas noches, yo voy a hablar en castellano. Bueno, en primer lugar, quiero felicitar mutuamente a las tres instituciones que han logrado la posibilidad de publicar finalmente Hatun Willakuy en inglés, que como tienen un recuerdo, se hizo una traducción en el 2004 y recién ahora podemos tomarlo en línea. Yo quisiera plantear, tomando como oportunidad la publicación de Hatun Willakuy, ¿qué ha significado el ejercicio de búsqueda oficial de verdad en el Perú 10 años después? Bueno, este año casi 11 en realidad, casi 12 años después de que se entregó el informe final de la Comisión de la Verdad. Es decir, qué impacto político, social, cultural ha tenido la CBR, y no pretendo hacer un balance de lo que eso ha significado, solamente me quiero referir a tres temas. Lo primero es qué se ha hecho efectivamente en términos de política pública en el país con relación a las recomendaciones de la CBR. Lo segundo, cuál ha sido el itinerario de discusión pública que se ha tenido sobre la CBR. Y lo tercero, cómo medir el impacto político en el país. Entonces, en el primer punto solamente quería decir que desde el 2004 tenemos una ley de reparaciones, que es el marco jurídico para otorgar las reparaciones en el país. No voy a discutir cuánto hemos avanzado, lo máximo que se ha avanzado es en reparaciones colectivas. Tenemos también una oficina especializada, la Comisión Multisectorial de Alto Nivel, que se ocupa del seguimiento de las recomendaciones de la Comisión de la Verdad. Como digo, se ha ocupado básicamente de reparaciones colectivas a lo largo de los 3 últimos gobiernos, y tenemos un registro único de víctimas, que es una institución encargada de acreditar a las víctimas, de dotar de una acreditación para que luego puedan recibir una reparación. Hay otro aspecto muy importante, que es el aspecto judicial, que no voy a tocar porque es parte del radar de cualquier análisis. Romero, que estaba aquí hace un momento, hace un seguimiento exhaustivo, por ejemplo, de los procesos judiciales en el país. El segundo aspecto que quería tocar es el itinerario de la discusión que ha tenido la CBR en el Perú, y solamente voy a dar cuenta de ese proceso a través de 3 hechos, nada más. Hay muchos más. Primero, la creación de la propia Comisión de la Verdad, que se convirtió en un primer momento de aceptación y acogida en el país, pero también de disputa. El proceso de transición estaba muy cerca, estaba muy reciente, y luego, en 2003, cuando se entrega el informe final de la Comisión de la Verdad, el debate recrudece, se hace mucho más intenso y más polarizado. Se critica, por ejemplo, la realización de audiencias públicas, pero también de alguna manera se revela una situación para el país no solo dolorosa en términos reales, inhumanos y hasta psicológicos, sino también en términos políticos, porque el 75% de las víctimas de la violencia en el Perú proceden de pueblos indígenas, y la sociedad peruana en promedio, limeña y regional, las élites sociales y políticas, habían obviado, digamos, la naturaleza principal del conflicto. Entonces sale a flote con el informe final un tema histórico en el país, que es la discriminación social, racial, económica, que en realidad nos invade hasta los huesos, ¿no? Y que ahora se ha visibilizado en los últimos años con mucha mayor fuerza, pero el informe final coloca esta situación terrible en el país y revela, entre comillas, esta situación. De otro lado, para otro sector, el informe final es considerado una afrenta para las Fuerzas Armadas, pero también para diversos gobiernos que tuvieron responsabilidad política durante los 20 años del conflicto armado interno. El debate da cabida a diversos actores políticos, incluidos algunos medios de comunicación que se posicionan también con esa narrativa, que se comportan como actores políticos, y surge otra vez, como digo, una disputa en el terreno público, en el terreno político. El segundo hecho que quiero relatar rápidamente es el memorial El Ojo que Llora. Es un memorial que está ubicado en la ciudad de Lima. Es una escultura realizada por la artista Lika Mutal, que empieza a generar una serie de cuestionamientos desde que se crea, porque el memorial incorpora los nombres de las víctimas que aparecen en el informe final de la Comisión de la Verdad. Los nombres están escritos en piedras que componen el monumento. Cada año las organizaciones de víctimas realizan una conmemoración a este lugar en fechas significativas. Se recuerda cada año también la entrega del informe final como una fecha emblemática para el país. Y también las organizaciones de víctimas recuerdan ese espacio en distintas fechas conmemorativas para ellos, ¿no? Porque en el Perú hay casi 15.000 desaparecidos, no hay restos entregados, y muchas personas, muchas víctimas buscan un lugar para recordar a sus seres queridos. Lo que ocurre con este lugar es que se convierte otra vez en un lugar de disputa. Aquí mi colega Romero ha escrito un texto sobre ello, cuando un sector conservador, también liderado por el partido de Alberto Fujimori, agrede el lugar y lo pintarrajea de color naranja, que es el color del partido. Entonces hay en esta ocasión un recrudecimiento otra vez de un sector conservador, se visibilizan nuevamente los ataques y se configura una reacción en contra de lo que representa la CDR. También las Fuerzas Armadas habían producido un contrainforme, un informe paralelo al de la comisión, que se denomina En honor a la verdad, ¿no? Entonces solamente quiero hacer notar que se produce una discusión acerca de quién ganó la guerra, quién es el salvador, y en el fondo también se produce una discusión acerca de si se puede legitimar o no los crímenes y violaciones a los derechos humanos mediante la acción política. Y el tercer hito que quiero traer a colación es la creación del lugar de la memoria en 2009. Es vamos a llamarle técnicamente un museo, se llama, el título es Lugar de la Memoria, la Tolerancia y la Inclusión Social. Se crea en 2009 cuando el gobierno de Alemania decide dar una donación de 2 millones de euros al gobierno peruano para construir este lugar de la memoria. El expresidente García se niega a recibir la donación y se produce toda una movilización de líderes de opinión, sobre todo, con el escritor Mario Vargas Llosa a la cabeza. Finalmente, después de toda esta movilización, se crea el lugar de la memoria, se nombra a Mario Vargas Llosa como presidente del lugar de la memoria. Salmón Lerner Febre, presidente de nuestro instituto, del IDEPUC, y expresidente de la Comisión de la Verdad, asume también la vicepresidencia. Pero otra vez, esta creación es un momento de nuevo debate entre actores políticos, donde otra vez se polarizan a favor y en contra del informe final. E incluso el propio Mario Vargas Llosa, cediendo a ciertas presiones, o quizá también porque tiene una convicción en ese sentido, sostiene que no va a denigrar de ninguna manera a la Fuerza Armada y se va a poner de relieve el heroísmo de nuestras Fuerzas Armadas. El lugar de la memoria tiene una historia más larga, hasta el momento todavía no ha sido inaugurado, pero tampoco se ha abierto como un espacio público. Existe poca información y más bien especulación acerca de los contenidos. Lo cierto es que no se ha logrado implementar un proceso de construcción social acerca del lugar de la memoria para darle vida al espacio. Esos tres hitos solamente los coloco porque en distintos momentos a lo largo de estos 10 años se han producido fuertes debates que han polarizado a la sociedad peruana. Estoy tratando de esquematizar para no entrar tanto en la complejidad. Y finalmente, el impacto político. Por un lado, ¿cómo se puede medir el impacto político de una comisión de la verdad? ¿Qué indicadores podemos tener? ¿Cómo podemos asir o no sobre los efectos que ha tenido? En el Perú en los últimos años han surgido, por ejemplo, nuevos liderazgos entre las organizaciones de víctimas, que se han ido convirtiendo en actores políticos regionales. Se trata de una nueva generación de líderes que tiene acceso a la educación, que incluso profesional, universitaria o técnica, buscan una interlocución con el Estado para promover políticas públicas sobre sus demandas de reparación. No requieren más de intermediarios estos líderes de organización, ¿no? Están asumiendo un nuevo liderazgo, una nueva autoridad política. Al mismo tiempo, tenemos también a los grandes actores de la política peruana. Quiero hacer esta comparación de manera esquemática otra vez, solo para dar cuenta de las paradojas que tenemos, ¿no? Y al otro lado tenemos a los grandes actores de la política nacional que todavía tienen cuentas con el pasado, ¿no? Fujimori, García, Humala. 11 años después asistimos a la paradoja de tener un proceso de verdad y memoria, pero donde todos los actores presidenciales, en este caso, tienen cosas escondidas en el closet, ¿no? Tienen cosas escondidas en la biblioteca. ¿Significa eso que la verdad y la memoria no cuentan para las actitudes políticas de la gente? ¿La población sigue votando por ellos a pesar de que conocemos que tienen esos problemas? En parte sí, pero en parte es el problema de haber tenido una transición o de seguir viviendo una transición sin un sistema de partidos fortalecido, sin un sistema político que permita sostener o conducir la institucionalidad democrática. Eso pone en juego también la representación como la conocemos en nuestros sistemas democráticos. En el sistema oficial tenemos a los actores políticos con estos problemas que señalaba, y en la representación real tenemos estos otros liderazgos que han aprendido a negociar incluso con el propio Estado. Entonces, de un lado tenemos estas representaciones que al final no participan en el sistema electoral. Es probable que después se conviertan en candidatos regionales también. Hay varios de los líderes que van a estar en carrera. Pero tenemos a los otros grandes actores que tienen cuentas con el pasado y que siguen siendo elegidos por la gente. 11 años después, aún se sigue discutiendo la legitimidad o no de la Comisión de la Verdad en el Perú y de su informe final, ¿no? Solo quería colocar que tenemos esta paradoja y cómo un documento como Hatun Willakuy va a volver a colocar nuevamente la discusión. Podemos discutir acerca de lo que significa el debate político en el Perú, que a veces puede ser muy plano, y sin embargo creo que es una herramienta valiosa para seguir dialogando de lo que aconteció en nuestro pasado y mirar hacia el futuro.
Gracias. Well, since we're dealing with an English translation, I will speak in English, even though I see that almost everyone here is bilingual. It is, of course, a pleasure to be associated in this event with the International Center for Transitional Justice. If it didn't exist, we would have to invent it. In fact, back when I was working on these issues, it didn't exist, and it did have to be invented, and it was. And I was there at the organizing meeting, and it's a marvelous institution. And also, it's a pleasure to be associated with the Institute of Human Rights of the Pontifical University of Peru for two reasons. First of all, it has one of the finest acronyms I've ever heard. IDEPUKIP. How can you not love an institution that is willing to go by that name? And secondly, it does wonderful work with regard to human rights in Peru. If you listen to National Public Radio ever in the United States, before they bring you news reports on particularly sensitive matters, they will tell you in advance, they will warn you that persons of delicate sensibilities may wish to turn off their radio for the next few minutes and pick up again when the sports comes on in 10 minutes. So let me warn you that I'm going to perhaps be touching on some subjects that for those of delicate political constitutions, you may wish to step outside and enjoy some hors d'oeuvres until we get to the Q&A session. I'm in favor of truth. I'm in favor of truth commissions. But truth is a very tricky business. We've heard a little bit tonight how the pursuit of truth has a legal dimension, and as Eduardo pointed out, it is now recognized, at least in soft law, as an internationally recognized right of victims. We heard from Iris how truth has a political dimension, often a contested political dimension. And for those of you who have had the opportunity, as I have, to read the introduction, the preface by Salvador, Romero, who was the president of the commission in Peru, and presented Hatun Willakuy. Truth also has a moral dimension. He speaks of how the Truth Commission in Peru had to confront two great evils: the evil of the hechos, the evil of the acts of violence that were committed, but also the evil of the indifference, of the uncaring, of the lack of concern. I think it was Eduardo mentioned, or maybe it was Iris, that 75% of the victims were indigenous. Indigenous people mostly live up in the mountains far away. It's easy not to care too much about them or think too much about them if you're down on the coast in Lima. You seem to be in a different century, a different country, a different civilization. And as in his eloquent presentation, Salvador pointed out, it's important that a truth commission confront the indifference as well as the violations. Truth matters not just because it's legally required or politically expedient. It matters because it has a profound moral dimension about what is the nature of a human society and what is the nature of each one of us. But if we look at truth commissions, not surprisingly, like every human institution, they have their limitations. Some of them, obvious limitations. There have been some failed truth commissions, and Eduardo could give you examples of chapter and verse of truth commissions that have been so significantly compromised by political considerations that they should be called untruth commissions. There are others that do a terrific job as far as they can, but they are under extreme political constraints. For example, the Guatemala Truth Commission was told it could not name names. I used to refer to the Guatemala Truth Commission as the Half-Truth Commission. But even the best of the commissions, and I think Peru is one of the best of the commissions, have to be very careful in their aspiration and in their claim to speak truth. Eduardo mentioned that he heard me long ago speak about the UN Truth Commission for El Salvador. We tried as hard as we could in the short period of time we were given with limited resources to tell the truth about what happened in El Salvador, and to some extent why, not as much as was later done in Peru. But our truth was bounded. During the Salvadoran Civil War from 1980 to 1992, the United States poured, if I recall correctly, $6 billion in military aid in support of the Salvadoran military. And $6 billion then is probably, if we have an economist at the House, it's probably $12 billion today, I don't know. You know, it's a lot of money. And it meant a lot of involvement by the United States in what went on in El Salvador. Some of it good, but not all of it good. And our Truth Commission said not a word about the involvement of the United States. We rationalized it because it wasn't part of our mandate under the peace accords, because because we had a limited period of time and we had our heads more than full just trying to tell the Salvadoran side of the story. But will any future historian look back to the violence in El Salvador in the 80s and early 90s and turn a blind eye to the role of the principal patron of the military and what might have been different had the United States behaved differently? I don't think so. Will anyone who attempts to judge the Salvadoran war, 75,000 deaths, I can't remember the numbers anymore, but huge numbers of disappearances and massacres and executions and so forth, attempt to judge that morally with one eye closed to the role of the United States of America and only looking at the role of the local Salvadoran elite? That's not my morality. But now let me turn to Peru, and again, those of you with delicate sensibilities may wish to leave the room. The Peruvian Truth Commission was courageous. It told a great deal of the truth. It talked about how the Sendero Luminoso, the Shining Path guerrillas, were terrorists, were ideological extremists, were inhumane. And we see echoes of that today in Boko Haram in Nigeria. We saw similar kinds of ideological extremism in the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. This kind of thing unfortunately pops up around the world from time to time. The Truth Commission bravely told of the violations committed by the forces of security in Peru. And in both of those truth tellings, it focused on sympathetic victims, on the peasants, on 75% of the victims who were indigenous, on the innocent campesinos who were used as pawns by both sides in the war in Peru. And that's all true, and that's good. And as Eduardo said implicitly, an important role of the Truth Commission is to be the kind of Archbishop Romero for whatever country they're in, to be the voice for the voiceless. And those truths are all easy for human rights advocates, for human rights lawyers to hear. They may be politically controversial with the reactionary forces, but they're easy for all of us to hear. They're convenient truths. They're the truths we've known all along, only now they're documented. But they're also inconvenient truths, truths that do not necessarily get emphasized. Truths that have to do with one of the goals of truth commissions, and this is emphasized in the very eloquent writings of Salvador, which is to show a commitment to the rule of law. The rule of law is for everyone. If human rights are indeed universal, then all human beings have those human rights. Even murderers. Just in the last few days, I was stunned to see that the execution of a murderer in a Midwestern state, maybe it was Oklahoma, was put on hold by, of all people, Justice Samuel Alito of the United States Supreme Court, who's about the last guy you would think would stay an execution of a murderer. But even this right-wing justice of the United States Supreme Court recognized that bad guys have human rights as well. In May of 1992, 1 month after Fujimori took over, there was a massacre at the Castro prison on the outskirts of Lima. Approximately 40 unarmed, defenseless prisoners were deliberately targeted and shot dead. And several hundred others were tortured, or wounded. The Truth Commission, to its credit, wrote a chapter on this case and recited the facts. So if you go into the 9 volumes of the Truth Commission, you'll find a report on this case. But if you read as much of Hatun Willakuy as I was able to read tonight, you won't find any mention of that case. It's an inconvenient truth in Peru. After the massacre took place sometime in the early 2000s, the victims, and yes, I said victims of that massacre, deliberately orchestrated by Fujimori and carried out as a deliberate massacre, not, as the cover story said, the repression of prisoner act. The victims of that massacre and their family members brought a case before the Inter-American Human Rights System that ultimately resulted in 2006 in a judgment in their favor before the Inter-American Court. Now, those victims were widely perceived by Peruvian society as being connected with Shining Path, with Sendero Luminoso. Some of them were represented by a lawyer who was formerly associated with them. I don't know whether she was a member of their group or not. But they were a factionalized group, so about 200 of them had no lawyer. They went to the human rights groups in Peru. Will you defend us before the Inter-American Commission? They went to the major human rights groups in the United States. Will you defend us before the Inter-American Human Rights System? No takers. Finally, they came to me and Sean O'Brien, who's sitting here in the room. Neither of us are Sandinistas by a long shot, but we believe that human rights means that everyone is entitled